So anyway, I tell them, right, if you do what I say, you can go back in a few weeks to the doctor and get the blood tests again. And I promise you, the doctor's jaw will drop. And each time, of course, I was correct.
Well, sorry guys, but I can't help being correct. I just know all the science. So I went on Jaymie Icke's podcast. It focuses all on health, and we went through some real key learnings from the past 15 years that I've had around metabolic health and how to transform your blood tests within weeks and make your doctor's jaw drop. So this is a great compilation of all of the best knowledge around health and longevity and weight loss, and we cover the omega index and so much more. So enjoy.
So we're going to dive into some of the root causes of chronic diseases today, some of them specifically, and we're going to dive into some of the ways that we can circumvent that and try and take back control of our health. So here's my interview with Ivor Cummings. Well, Ivor, thank you so much for joining me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. As I said in my intro there, chronic diseases right across the world are just exploding. Places like America, we're seeing almost half the population now suffering with one or more of them and taking pharmaceutical medications every day as a result. So if we look at some of the most common ones, a big one that we hear talked about here in the UK is type 2 diabetes, which is a massive one, which is obviously very diet influential. Is this something that's been a progressive rise, do you think, or have you seen an explosion in this in the last few years?
Yeah, Jaymie. Well, I'd say an explosion since the 90s and into 2000 was probably the inflection point in the curve. And you can see, for instance, it's quite comical. People blame red meat. There's a lot of AntiMeat Agenda, of course. There's nothing to do with health. But there's an interesting graph, I think, from Nina Teicholz. It could be someone else. And it just shows the red meat consumption per capita in the US falling over 50 years. And at the same time, the type 2 diabetes rate literally exponentially rising.
Right.
So we see this all the time. In short, the primary root cause, to the best of myself, professors of medicine, and my network all over the world, the primary driver is insulin resistance, which is type 2 diabetes. That's driving the heart disease, many of the solid tumor cancers, the big killers. Alzheimer's now is being referred to as type 3 diabetes, so insulin resistance in the neurological kind of arena. But the primary cause of insulin resistance, if we cut straight to the chase, I have a phrase for over 10 years now, the devil's triad. And the devil's triad is simply sugars, refined grains, and seed oils, these factory chemical plant vegetable oils, supposedly heart healthy. So that's the devil's triad. And the problem is, if you eliminate largely sugars and refined grains and vegetable oils, that's pretty good. But the problem is most of ultra-processed foods are made up primarily of those three components. So we have in the UK now, I think around 5 years ago, the BMJ came out and over 50% of foods consumed in the UK are ultra-processed foods. The definition varies, but my triad is the main component. And if you're eating over half of your nutrition from the devil's triad, which drives insulin resistance / type 2 diabetes, which is the primary driver of modern chronic disease, you know, you got a problem. And that's largely our explosion in short.
I think you're being very generous calling it nutrition, to be fair. So much of what people eat is the polar opposite of that. And yeah, that study, I shared something on that a few weeks ago. Yeah, 50%, over 50%. It's the worst in Europe, the UK, in terms of highly processed foods. And I think we live in a weird time where I don't think many people would think that's healthy, even though they eat it and they get on with it and they give it to their kids. They probably know it's not any good, but we've got like a weird psychological state that people still seem to do it. But before we dive into that, I'd love to dive into what you said then about that triad, because that's a really interesting point. Because again, sugar, I think most people would agree, yeah, sugar's not great. I try and limit it. Seed oils, I think, are a really interesting area to go, because we've obviously seen a big push in the last few years towards using things like rapeseed oils, using things like sunflower oils, canola oils, and so on, all of which would come under that parameter of seed oil. So could you explain to our viewers, what is a seed oil and what qualifies it as a seed oil compared to, say, like a traditional oil such as olive oil?
Right. Yeah. And it's a question, Jaymie, I get asked a lot. Well, Ivor, what oils are okay? And people ask, is olive oil okay? Well, the seed oils, basically, if they're chemically extracted with hexane and solvents from seeds like sunflower or any of these other seeds, or rapeseed, indeed, you mentioned, that's pretty much, they're high omega 6, certain type of fat, oils that have been processed extensively, and they can be inflammatory in the body, and they're kind of a form of fake food. So if you eat sunflowers, sprinkled on your dinner, that's irrelevant. The digestion of them is very limited, and I guess sometimes they even come out the other end. But if you use temperature, pressure, solvents, people need to realize these are chemical plants, essentially, and I'm originally a chemical engineer. If you look at the process for making seed oils, you would never eat them. Just look at the video. And they go through vat after vat. And the people working in the plant need to wear respirators, because at one point there's a rancid, foul smelling kind of muck. And then it goes through deodorizing. So they remove nature's warning not to eat it by deodorizing chemically. And then they color it to make it golden and healthy. Wow. So people just need to think of these vegetable oils as chemically produced quasi-fake foods. They do come from technically a real food, but the processing is horrific. And really, there's a massive correlation over the last century since Crisco realized that, wow, we have all these oils we use for lawnmowers and lubrication, but they very closely resemble food oils. So I wonder, could we do something? So they hydrogenated them and forced in hydrogens and essentially made them more saturated, like a saturated fat. And then they made the Crisco margarine, the hard block. And that was the start of the era. And the correlation over the past century with modern chronic disease is quite stunning, but it doesn't prove causation. So there's a lot of debate still as to the refined carbs and sugars or the inflammatory seed oils, which is the bigger hitter. And I always tell people, look, there's extensive evidence on both and debate, mainly with the seed oils, because industrially they're so important. They're the basis of international corporate food systems. So industry kind of acknowledges sugar is bad. They fund nutrition colleges, etc., and training and doctors to make sure they say that bread is good, right? Healthy whole grains. They allow that, sugar's bad, as I said, but they will not allow seed oils. It's simply too important. They cost a penny. You sell them for £1. They contribute to stability and shelf life of the ultra-processed foods. They're too important. So there's still a debate, but I always say both of them are certainly something you should not be eating. So eliminate both. In the absence of proving which is a more dominant cause, simply eliminate both. This isn't rocket science.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said there about, is it this or is it that? I think it's a cumulative effect, isn't it? And there's probably there's a ton of other things that we haven't discussed yet as well that are all cumulatively adding to it. It's like you're being almost assaulted from every single angle, and you've got to watch everything you put in your body. Because when I first read about seed oils, probably about 10 years ago now, I was shocked at how much they are in, because it's in pretty much everything. You go to the shelf. Obviously, I'm very, very conscious now. I check where every single thing I eat comes from. But I quite often will pick up a packet and I'll look and go, it's got vegetable oil in it, it's got this in it, it's got that. And it's nothing you would expect to have any of those things in it. And I think what they've done really cleverly, haven't they, is by using the term vegetable oil, people associate vegetables with health, therefore that's great. And they don't actually look into, as you said there, the process of how they're made and actually what goes into them, and therefore the effect that's going to have on the body. So you mentioned about how inflammatory they are, and obviously sugar is incredibly inflammatory as well. That's something that once you look into it and the impact that inflammation has within the body, and how diseases like cancers and so on are inflammation based. But most people, I don't think, quite understand that dynamic and how that works. So when you say they cause inflammation in the body, could you talk us through that process a little bit?
Yeah. So inflammation, people often say, oh, well, inflammation is the cause of disease. Well, not really. So inflammatory processes are your body's immune system reacting to a threat or an insult. So the inflammation is actually your body trying to deal with an inappropriate input. And of course, it links immensely to disease outcomes, because once you provoke your immune system to react and try and manage things, you're in a state of inflammation. And if that's chronic, it leads to all kinds of disruptions of chemical pathways and nasty feedback loops. And that's promoting of disease. So that's kind of inflammation. Now, the oils particularly, so basically, if you consume omega-6 oils, so if people think of saturated fats, which is, beef tallow, etc., or lard, you've got kind of monounsaturated fats, which is olive oil, and they're pretty stable, but the saturated fats are the most stable. So most of our body's fat is ideally stored by our body in saturated and monounsaturated forms, because they're stable. The chemical bonds are very robust and they're not open to oxidation and damage. Okay, so saturated, monounsaturated, pretty stable. Then when you get to omega-3, the fish oils, now they're unsaturated and they have double bonds available, so they can get damaged, but they're generally good. And then there's omega-6 essential oils, which are also less stable, but we need some of them. So traditionally, we had around 0.5 to 1% of our diet was omega-3, omega-6, and that was the natural evolutionary percentage or proportion in our diet, around 1%. Now we're up, and I think you mentioned, at around 15, 16, 17%. So there's an enormous order of magnitude increase. And as Professor Jeff Volek said once, I think in San Diego in 2016, I had the honor of meeting him, genius. He said that these omega-3s and omega-6s are not just calories. They're not really food. They're signaling molecules. So they take part in a lot of immune and inflammatory processes. They're kind of more signaling molecules than calories, like saturated fat that gives you energy so you can live. So he said we should be around the 1%, maybe 2%, but we certainly shouldn't be going up over that. Now, the interesting thing, Jaymie, I found a load of papers in the 1990s. There were rat studies, and they started in the mid-90s, and they kept building on each other. And what they were all saying was essentially lard and tallow are non-carcinogenic in rats that are injected with carcinogens to give them loads of tumors. And then you give 1/2 tallow and 1/2 omega-6 oils. And they noted clearly tumorigenesis or carcinogenesis associated with excess quantities of the omega-6. Then eventually, after a few more papers and more teams got involved, they actually found something quite profound. And they said it in the paper. They said that after 3 or 4% of omega-6 fats in the diet, the increase in cancer in the rats plateaus. So if you have 1% of them, you've got a certain level of problem. And as you go to 2, 3, 4% in the diet, you get increasing mammary tumors or whatever tumors they were looking at. But they noticed at 4, 5, 6%, there was no more increase. And they made a very interesting observation. Because the population's now at 12, 13, 14% of these oils, and we used to be at 1%, if you look at the population and do a study of people at like 15%, like high seed oils, or low seed oils, 7%, you're not going to see a difference in cancer.
Yep.
And you're going to come to conclusion, oh, there isn't an effect or an association. So they said this plateau effect is actually potentially very dangerous. And the interesting thing, Jaymie, was no conspiracy theories. The reality is in the late 90s, suddenly all of these papers stopped being published. And you just know, someone noticed them, realized that the whole industry and medicine was telling people to max out on vegetable oils. And now you had teams talking cancer from vegetable oils. Okay. So all the research stopped. And we see that again and again and again. So pro-inflammatory oils, the omega-6 excess that I mentioned, but on top of that, you've got the molecular damage from the hexane and the petrochemical solvents and the heating. So on top of excess omega-6, when you're taking a high vegetable oil diet, you've got all of the varying degrees of damage to the molecules, which will enhance the problem. And last thing I'll say, Jaymie, all of our cells need fluidity. The cell needs to have fluidity. So in the cell membrane of our 38 trillion cells, you need unsaturated fats like these, certain amounts of them, to give fluidity to the cell membrane. It's important. So you need a minimum, 0.5 or 1%. They're essential. But when you go higher and your cell membranes get more and more unsaturated fats in them, particularly damaged via industrial processes, now all of your cells are being exposed, right, to oxidation, which is one of the precursor stages of inflammatory problems. So the whole thing's really nasty.
Hey guys, this is just a quickie interlude, just to give you a heads up on some of what's going on in the world of finance. Financial health is very important too. And Christopher Mullen is one of the many technical traders who do all the analysis on the curves and what's happening in the market. And he's been guarded about physical gold over the past 6 months, acknowledging that it's got huge potential, but quite guarded. And very recently, just a few days ago, I'm going to show you a quick clip, and he is changing tack now and aligning with all of my other analysts and hedge fund people worldwide. So you'll see here in this short clip, he's talking firstly about the 2007 period when we got a big market crash of what happened physical gold during that time. And then he goes on to the current day and what him and all of his analysts are predicting for gold in the coming months.
The stock market was pushing to all-time highs, and gold was giving us this huge warning sign that, hey, if gold is outperforming everything else, including the stock market, you better be aware there is some global fear. There's probably going to be a global financial reset. And that's what gold is really good for. Silver doesn't do it, miners don't do it, but physical gold pricing does. And what's interesting is here, after we saw it top out, the market went a little bit higher, and then the stock market started to sell off. And what happened with gold, if you follow that yellow line, that gold shot up 37% while the stock market fell 20%. And then what happens is if we hit this 618 level and we have a bit of a pause in price, we almost always see price go to the 100% measured move. So based on this rally, we'll have that same rally afterwards. And that is pointing to about a 20% rally from where gold is right now. And that coincides perfectly with what happened in 2007. Stock market sells off. People think, things are falling apart, and everybody moves to physical assets. Gold is by far the best play, which if we go through silver.
Super smart guy is Christopher Mullen. So anyway, we'll go back to the interview, but the link is down below, both to Chris's interview and also to my personal link through to the guys at Pure Gold. And you can take the opportunity to learn some more and protect you and your family's wealth in the likely troubled times coming over the next 6 to 12 months. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very nasty. And oxidation and oxidative stress seem to be things that are triggered by so many of the things that we're seeing rolled out now. EMF is another good example, because I think there's a few parallels between that and seed oils, where there's that refusal to publish data, as you pointed out there with seed oils. There's a refusal to do the studies that they know are going to conclude what they don't want them to conclude, I should say. And there's so much money and investment gone into it that it's almost far too big to fail, kind of like the smoking industry probably was at one point. And I think there's so many times through history we can look and go, well, they've lied to us and they've told us what we already knew eventually, but it was way too late for so many people, unfortunately, and we hope that we don't get to the same point again. So for people that are watching, if they've, say, been on a high seed oil diet, I suppose it's a two-part question. How would they find out what percentage that they're at, or is that something they have to would work out themselves, or is there some kind of glucose or blood test that they can do? And secondly, can you repair, do you think, the damage that's been caused already? So if someone sat watching this and then went, right, I'm never having a seed oil again, and they stuck to that, could they repair the damage that's potentially already been done?
Yeah, okay. So second question is, can they repair? And the answer broadly is yes. So that's a good news story. The first question was?
The first question was to do with how you find out the levels that you are within your body, yeah.
Yeah, so there's an omega-6 or 3-6 ratio blood test. And I can't remember the units because I've been around 5 years more in geopolitics than health. But that test in America, they're generally around 3.8, which is very low omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. And then in Japan, they're more like 10 or 11, which is actually very healthy. So I don't offhand recall the details in the units, but there is an omega-3, omega-6 balance blood test. And in the one I'm familiar with that all the publications about heart disease were on, and they showed these correlations that within populations, the people, like I think the MRFIT study, big one, within populations, when you're higher in the ratio, you have lower heart disease quite dramatically. And across countries, when a country is higher, it has much lower heart disease. So that's the omega-3, omega-6 ratio test. And there may be different names for it. So check it out, Google it, and you'll hit upon it. I got it many years ago, and thankfully I was up at 11 or something, or 11.5. In terms of the damage, of course, the body has enormous capability for reparative processes. Now, if you've gotten very overweight and you've eaten a lot of this processed food and seed oils, it will be sequestered in your body. So it will take time to clear it all out. I mean, understandably. But if you switch to a real foods diet, our ancestors, I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. Meat, fish, and eggs, and not much else. You will rapidly begin to recover your health. It's quite astonishing. Sleep quality, weight loss, mental acuity, everything's going to get better. I've told people, Jaymie, on multiple occasions when they've showed me their blood tests and I've said, yeah, you're diabetic. And they've always been really angry. The doctor said, I'm not type 2 diabetic. I asked him after the last time you said it to me, and I said, your doctor doesn't understand. Look at your liver enzymes. Look at the doctor only looks at the glucose. You got to look at all your other measures. So anyway, I tell them, right, if you do what I say, you can go back in a few weeks to the doctor and get the blood tests again. And I promise you, the doctor's jaw will drop. And each time, of course, I was correct. So literally within weeks, you can go from type 2 diabetic to technically non-type 2 diabetic,
Yeah,
and I always try and keep it easy for people who say, look, I don't want the science. I don't want a big list of menus. Meat, fish, and eggs, and anything outside of real food that comes from a tree, unprocessed, or from an animal, etc. You just eat real food purely with no processed food for 4 weeks, your doctor's jaw will drop, and it always drops. So that speaks to, the ability to recover the situation.
Yeah, 100%. And you've only got to look at history and look at the animal kingdom and see how the diets of animals hasn't really changed over the years. The domesticated pets has, and the length of time they live has reduced to what it would have been once. Animals in the wild, a lion's diet's not changed in the last century. They're still doing the same thing. Whereas we've become so overcomplicated with what we should eat. Whereas, like you say, go back into our ancestors. I always go with the adage, kind of, if you walk into a supermarket and your grandparents wouldn't recognize any food, don't buy that. Simple
Perfect.
as that. So much of the stuff that we see, all these, big one for me is kids' breakfast cereal. It's one of the biggest pet hates of mine is that stuff, because they, not only is it full of crap, but the manipulative marketing techniques they use to try and get parents to buy them. That's one of the worst. None of those things existed, obviously, all those years ago. As you mentioned there, meat, fish, eggs, seasonal fruits and seasonal vegetables that you can get in your local area, straight from source. Those sort of things are what we are absolutely designed to eat. And you're right. I think anybody that's tried that lifestyle, even for a very short period, couple of weeks, can feel the difference. I mean, People understand the difference there, don't they? You must see that yourself with the people you've worked with.
It's astonishing. I mean, I'll tell a brief story. Just before the cerveza sickness, or that thing in 2020 started, I was on stage giving a keynote in Denver, and literally had to change flights and get out just before they shut the airports. Quite funny. But when I got to the conference, it was almost cancelled because everyone was hyping up about the viral thing. And luckily it went ahead, but we missed quite a few people. But I went into the hall and we're all hugging and chatting, and there was no masks, everyone pretty much was aware it was kind of nonsense, like swine flu. And this fat guy, big fat guy, Indian extraction, ran over to me and gave me a bear hug. And he said, Ivor, thank you for saving my life. And I said, okay, then. He says, and he was beaming. He said, I'm an internal medicine specialist. So he's a senior doctor. And he said, I got your book 9 months ago. You know how much weight I lost? And I said, and I looked at him. He said, I know I'm still fat, but I was very fat. So he laughed. He was full of joy. He had lost, I think, 55 pounds.
Wow.
Or like 25 kilos, something. Oh, wow, congratulations. And he said to me, you know how long it took me to reverse my type 2 diabetes, which he had had for 8 or 9 years. And I said, well, I guess you're going to say a pretty short time, like a few weeks. He said 9 days. And I said, well, hold on. Your glucose fell. And he said, no, I was measuring insulin. So insulin is the measurement that tells you much sooner whether you're diabetic or not. And it's a much better measurement. So using insulin, in fairness, in 9 days, his insulin was indicating non-diabetes. And then he told me he did 0 calcium score, which is a whole other topic we probably won't get into. But he was very lucky. Even though he had diabetes for a decade and his arteries should have been all furred up, he genetically was lucky in the sense that his ability to deal with inflammation obviously was such that he hadn't sustained too much damage yet. And now here he was. And he said, my whole energy, my life transformed. He said, I'm able to do way longer hours. I'm not stressed. I feel great. It was a great moment. But you can multiply that by, in my case, thankfully, I'm humbled, thousands. Like my recent speaking tour in the UK, I did 4 venues and 2 or 3 people in each said they discovered my health stuff through the viral stuff. Wow. They got my book and they were generally losing 20 or 30 pounds and they looked fantastic.
Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible. Did you say you were on a flight back from Denver? Would have been March 2020 then?
Yeah, it was.
There's a distinct possibility we were on the same flight back to London. I landed back from Denver the day that Trump banned European flights going into America.
I landed into London and then luckily got an Aer Lingus flight. I think it was a Monday morning. And I got the last flight, Aer Lingus, I think, in from London. But I came in, I guess, the Monday morning. It might have been the 16th or something. Or...
Yeah, I think we may well have been on the same flight. It was a jumbo jet with about 20 people on the whole flight from Denver.
Yes, I was in American Airlines. And then one of the anesthetists who runs the conference said to me, Ivor, I was on the phone to AA for like half an hour and no answer. And he said, forget about ringing them. Just go straight to the airport in an Uber and just see what you can get. And they switched me from American Airlines to British Airways.
Yep.
And they told me the flight was full. So get to the gate. And when I got on the flight, there was around 20 people.
Yeah. We genuinely may have been on the same flight. That's hilarious if so. That's hilarious.
I'll
have a look at my, try and find out which date I was on. But yeah, it sounds about right. That's hilarious if that's the case.
That's funny.
But what you're saying there about, going back to simplicity and the evidence that we've seen of that. What's your take at the moment on what you're seeing with the kind of Instagram influencer types who are polarizing this concept of diet? You've got, vegan influencers saying you should be doing this, should be doing that. And then you've got on the other end of the spectrum, you've got, just eat red meat, nothing else. You don't need anything else at all. Do you think there's, as with everything, there's extremes on both sides and the truth's more in the shade of grey? What's your take on that? Do you think that's of benefit for people's health, or do you think it's just giving people way too much information? They don't really know what's real, what's not, and as a result, people are getting a bit lost.
Yeah, no, absolutely, it's a problem. So you've got a mixture of obviously massive industry influence. Like I said, nutrition industry is run by the big food, and they train all the nutritionists indirectly. They've been doing it for decades. And then big pharma does all the kind of courses for doctors. They need to keep up with their continued medical education, CME, and pharma has their fingers well in that pie. So there's a massive problem of misinformation. I hate using the word these days, coming from industry. But then you've got all the ideological, the vegan and the animal stuff. it's an absolute hot mess. So I was doing a 2.5 hour kind of interactive live workshop on weight loss. I also did mental strength and critical thinking a couple of months ago. But I put all those diets on one slide and I explained the problem with what I would call fad diets. So whether it's the Pritikin diet or the Kempner rice diet or the potato diet or the vegan or raw foods diet, none of them have any resemblance whatsoever to Homo sapiens' ancestral evolutionary diet. They just don't. So there's a very simple way to cut through all of the crap. And I always say to people, is it largely what our ancestors ate? And we know 97% plus of paleoanthropologists, if not 100, unless they're lying, acknowledge that Homo sapiens evolved from the scavenging of organ meats and carcasses and then became the most successful hunters on the planet. So our very evolution as a species that allows us to talk about this is simply due to the two-legged hominids hitting meat. And then through the expensive tissue hypothesis, we are off the Kleiber line. So there's a line based on stomach size and energy and diet, and all the mammals based on their weight are on this line, and humans are way off it because we made that leap. We began to get nutrient dense, super nutrient dense foods, and we were able to effectively hunt, and then we just went off the line. You know, our stomach shrank because we traded off digestive freedom. Like an ape has a big stomach and digests plants, turns them into fats, and then gets energy from them. Big stomach, small brain. We went absolutely up the wazoo, very, well, nowadays, not so much, but very small stomach. Look at an ancestral man, hardly any stomach at all, and the biggest brain on the planet. So I'm kind of wandering on now, but yeah, go to what's ancestral, paleoanthropologically correct, biochemically correct, nitrogen and carbon dating all show us as hypercarnivores above the fox from the dating of human remains 10,000 years ago. Go through the mummies. Every single branch of science pushes you towards meat, fish, and eggs, or meat and two veg. Yeah. Every single branch of science brings you there. There is no branch of science that slightly goes away from that. So that's your human diet. Now look back at the vegan and the raw foods and the Kempner rice diet, and the potato diet, and they're absurd. Yeah. It's as simple as that. They're absurd. It's crazy. It drives me crazy for 12 years now.
Well, I know a lot of people use the image. I've seen it a few times on Instagram of the hippo, which is obviously a vegetarian and very fat, lots of blubber, and they compare that to a lion that literally just eats meat. She's lean, strong, fit, and kind of which one do you want to be? I mean, I saw something the other day which I did find interesting. It just I'll start by saying I live keto paleo diet, pretty much the diet that you're describing.
You can tell.
So I'm certainly not on this side of the argument, but I did think this point was interesting. I saw it was a carnivore account that tweeted about human beings being the apex predator, which is kind of similar to what you've just described there as well, I would suggest. And this comment was from a vegan who said, well, we're only that because of weapons. And he said, if you put human beings and a lion in a cage and they went at it, we'd get beat, we'd get battered. So in terms of predator-based, we're predators because of spears and things like that we would have used to hunt. And obviously now, guns and so on, more sophisticated. And it did make me think slightly, how does that work then?
Well, yeah, I'm just trying to think. There's no contradiction there. I'm not sure what the point is trying to be made in any defense of veganism, but it's just reality of evolution. So we started off scavenging as hominids, and we developed our brains through scavenging carcasses, scaring away predators, probably using primitive forms of weapons in clusters of groups of nomads, etc. This is not contested. And then as we developed more intelligence and better weapons, and then switched more into a hunting mode. But again, I'm not sure what it really says. It's just paleoanthropology. It's just human evolution.
I just found it interesting because it was just a concept that I'd not heard described before.
it's a good example of self-reinforcing loops, which are in engineering, they're in biochemistry, and they're in geopolitics actually as well. But yeah, as we develop more intelligence, the eating of the meat beget our ability to advance more weapons, which enabled us to get even more access to meat and super nutrition. So it's like it's an acceleration, and maybe that's one reason in evolution that you get quite sudden shifts over like 500,000 years, which in the timeline of the Earth is very small, but it's like some species change quite suddenly. We're the extreme example. Yeah. And one of the reasons is it's self-reinforcing loops. We just hit the mega jackpot. And someone told me recently, it's kind of weird, what's the weight of all the mammals on Earth versus the weight of all the humans on Earth? Now, you don't include insects and other things, just mammals. And it turns out, I think, we're around 80% of the weight of meat on the Earth. And if you include, or maybe we're 60, but you include our farm animals, we're 85. So yeah, we just became the ultra successful species on the planet, clearly, through all those mechanisms.
Yeah, I'd agree. Definitely going to get a steak for dinner now. What do you think when you do all the research that you're doing and the things you described, and you see such a blatant anti-meat agenda, whether it be ideologically, as you've just described, vegans and so on, and also whether it be this constant excuse of climate change, which is a new one that we can't do this, we can't do that, as a result. And we're seeing, people being pushed towards eating bugs and things like that, and insects, which Mr. Gates is very much at the forefront of. Yeah, I doubt he gives up his steak dinners. What do you think? Do you take that as just a clear, blatant attack on people's health? Because if what you're saying and describing is right, if people do start to eat less meat as we evolve, that's going to lead to even more health problems than we're seeing today. So do you see that as just a blatant attack on health, this meat agenda or anti-meat agenda?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of things, and there's a confluence or conspiracy of interests here that all of industry would like to see us eat less meat, because meat is fresh, nutrient-dense food. All of big pharma would like to see us eat less meat because meat tends to promote health. They don't want that, obviously. It's bad for the quarterlies and Wall Street. You've got the geopolitical forces, the so-called elites, and they psychologically feel better when they master their species and lord over us. Hence the desire for world government, 15-minute cities. They feel better when their own species is subjugated, just like all the kings and leaders of history and psychopaths. So you've got all these interests, unfortunately, coming together in a confluence to push against meat. And add on top of that, you've got religious stuff. And add on top of that, you've got people who are animal lovers, right? So you can kind of get a picture, unfortunately, the array of forces against us, whether just ignorant and stupid people or whether malign people or profiteering people. It's an enormous army, and they all work together. So the food and a lot of the regulatory people fund the activist groups and the NGOs. They use them for propaganda. Long story short, it probably culminated with the WHO around 7 or 8 years ago, I think, came out and announced that meat was a carcinogen.
Yeah.
It's just the most absurd thing you could ever hear. And they went through around 1,000 papers. Most of them were associational, correlational claptrap, and it didn't say anything of relevance. And then they had a few experiments, but they were kind of mice experiments, and the mice experiments didn't even back up what they were saying. So it was clear as crystal a con job. Zoe Harcombe in the UK and others have taken this apart. I just shared their blogs. Outrageous, right? They shoehorned crap data just to politically say meat was a carcinogen for political purposes, the anti-meat agenda. So we got a problem, but I think, Jaymie, people are waking up on climate, on the anti-meat agenda, and all the other scams. People are becoming more aware that something's really smelly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, meat is a superfood, by any rational definition of superfood. People talk about kale. I mean, leaves, maybe there's some minerals in them, bits and pieces. It's meaningless. Eggs are a superfood. Organ meats are a superfood. The nutrient-dense meats that allowed us to become the most successful species on the planet, without any question, they are the superfoods. Anyone who says otherwise is an idiot.
Where do you sit on dairy, out of interest?
Dairy, interesting one. In our book, Eat Rich, Live Long, myself and Dr. Gerber did point out that dairy can cause, in some people, an immune reaction and a kind of an autoimmune problem. Now, there's casein, I think A1 and A2, and if you go for the older type protein dairy, I think you get it from goat's cheese and certain breeds of cattle. And people who have an immune reaction to dairy can do this, and it's very successful, I believe. But you could be unlucky and be one of the relative minority that have a reaction to dairy. So there's a little quibble with dairy, and even egg whites, the proteins, some people can have a non-ideal reaction. So in fairness, great you said it, there's some little caveats, but meat, egg yolks, and fish certainly, broadly, are the safest possible foods for health. And if you have any autoimmune issues, which mostly come from plant world proteins, so you get molecular mimicry. I mean, celiac and gluten is just the cliched example. 1% of humans will die if they keep eating gluten. It's a big deal. 30 or 40% get varying degrees of problems that they never associate with the gluten or the gliadin or the other components in wheat or lectins. The plant world is full of potential problems for humans. Now, I'm lucky. I'm guessing you're probably lucky as well. We can eat mostly anything like the scavengers we are, but there's sizable minorities who get very severe problems. And, I interviewed Michaela Peterson in Texas back in 2016, I think. Great interview.
She's extreme, isn't she?
She's extreme, but her process of problem solving would make an engineer jealous. And I complimented her on it. In the middle of a psychological and literally getting her joints replaced crisis from the autoimmune, from the plant food she was eating, through all that depression and haze, she managed to track and realize there was a lag effect, that the reason she couldn't associate her problems with specific foods was sometimes there was a lag before the effect occurred. So she was mixing up what she was eating and what was problem and what was not. And she kept a diary and she corrected for the lag effect. And of course, she ended up going towards carnivore because it's the safest possible food for any human. And she needed to lean that way because she was so reactionary. But the other thing about dairy, just a quick finish on that, Jaymie, we also warn that people who need to lose weight and they're on a plateau and they're finding it difficult, cheeses can be very moreish, very energy dense, very easy to pile in serious energy. So we just warn also about dairy on that front. If you're pouring loads of double cream into many coffees a day and you think you're dieting, you just look up at the energy in that cream and the amount you're using, and you might get a surprise. Wow, I dropped in 400 extra calories there that I never even thought about. So that's the only other caveat with dairy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think quality of dairy as well, raw milk and raw cheeses, raw butter and so on is really important as well. I've come up with a theory on plants and why, if you say if you're hunting an animal's got its own defense mechanisms to try and stop you from catching it, whereas a plant hasn't. It's just sat there. You can pick it. So what if the plant's defense mechanism is the fact that some of these will contain certain poisons and certain elements that are detrimental to human health, deadly nightshades and things like that? Bit of a theory, might be a complete load of rubbish, but it's a concept that makes some sense, I suppose.
It makes absolute sense because we know it's true to some extent, like you mentioned nightshade, but we know lectins are a serious problem. And some people are surprised. They eat kidney beans. Well, they have to be boiled to deactivate the lectins. So a handful of kidney beans will kill an average man half the time. You can kill someone with a handful of kidney beans. And yet we all eat them in tins and we think, oh, they're great healthy food. And well, technically they are, but it's just another example. And gluten will kill 1 in 100 people on the planet if they all ate it. I mean, people don't think about this. What you're saying is true. I think Stephen Gundry, Dr. Gundry, wrote The Plant Paradox, which actually is a whole book on exactly that point. So if anyone wants proof, there's a whole book there, The Plant Paradox.
That's true. I know why I've got some in the cupboard I haven't touched for years. They're still sat there.
Yeah.
Final question for anyone watching that's really interested in taking control for their health and really interested in starting again as a result of what they've heard tonight. Where would you suggest they start if they're looking, going, okay, this is all great, sounds brilliant, but where do I start tomorrow morning? What would your advice be?
Well, yeah, pushing his book, eh? Well, the book, to be honest, and you're probably aware of this, you get $1 or $2 out of a $20 price when you're with the official publisher, like we went with Victory Belt. So it's a joke. But no, our book, Eat Rich, Live Long, has stood the test of time. I still get interviewed about it, and people still appear at my speaking events, like holding the book. I got your book, as I mentioned earlier. So I think I was lucky to be sponsored by a very wealthy Irishman at the time who wanted to save the world from heart disease. So he funded us a lot of money to get professional editors, etc. But Eat Rich, Live Long goes through everything in easy form, all the recipes, deeper science, and then deeper science if you want to get in deep and be convinced. And we have over 300 scientific references in the print volume at the back. So I think that is a great way. In general, like if you Google my name with any topic relating to health, you'll probably hit my YouTubes on it. The calcium score, diabetes, insulin resistance, weight loss. There's a lot of other resources out there, but to your earlier point, you got to be really careful not to fall into the clutches of the fad diet and others. So I'd say Diet Doctor is subscription, but there's myriad free recipes, keto and low carb. So it's a really easy, dietdoctor.com. And I mean, there's a lot of resources, but if you stick to the low carb keto people, you're broadly in a safe zone. You know, they will have versions of more vegetarian for people with ideological biases, but you're generally safe. But if you go outside low carb keto, and it's not just because I'm biased, you're just at risk of getting into the fad zone or the industry zone or the dietary guideline zone. I'll tell you one last thing, Jaymie. A relation of mine, close relation, I did that, go back to your doctor and his jaw will drop. It was a him in this case, not a him, her, or a trans. And he went back and the doctor was just astonished. And exactly what I told him, because he was a little cynical, because he's a relation, you know, you don't like your own people to be saying every expert is wrong and I'm right. It looks arrogant. So he's a little skeptical. So he did it anyway. His wife loved it because after a few weeks, his double chin shrank and his stomach, specifically his stomach, he had a pot belly, he was diabetic, shrank. So that was great. So he went back in, the doctor looked at the results and was just completely confused. He could not understand in a few weeks why all these disease markers got that much better. So fine. And he asked him, oh, are you doing anything different? And my relation said he didn't want to start an argument. So he just said, I looked up the internet and it said for blood pressure and kidney problems, you might be better off eating less sugar and stuff like that, bread. So I kind of did that. And he acted naive. And the doctor got annoyed and said, don't be looking at internet rubbish. And he went over, opened his filing cabinet. And the new food pyramid, they know now they were wrong. So the new food pyramid does not have the bottom all bread and pasta anymore. They've made it the eat well plate or the eat badly plate, as Zoe Harcombe says. But he went to his filing cabinet and presented him with a traditional food pyramid. He said, this is the way you need to be eating, and handed him his own death. The whole base is bread and pasta. And he already had blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, right, and kidney issues on the way. Doctor handed him a death sheet. So that's the kind of crap that's still going on, you know?
Yeah, it is. I've got a doctor friend of mine who specialises in helping people overcome type 2 diabetes. And he said if I wanted to give someone diabetes, I'd give them the exact diet the British diabetic website tells them to give in terms of solving it. Because it's just, exactly what you just said. Refined sugars, refined carbs, and limiting those foods which help with that. So
Exactly.
it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you, and I think our audience are gonna really enjoy this conversation. I'll put a link to the book in the description. I do a separate program as well, like a book review show. So I'll get a copy of the book and give it a read and do a show on that in a few weeks. But thank you so much for your time. It's been really a real pleasure.
Great stuff, Jaymie. Catch you again later. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Bye now.
Take care.
That'll do it, folks. Jaymie seems like a really great guy, and he certainly looks fantastic. He is doing all the health stuff, and mentioned, I think, that he's also doing keto and the proper kind of low-carb regime. So final note, the link is down below and on the screen to my personal connection through to Pure Gold in London, and their experts will advise on everything financial and also the importance of metals. It's very easy to get involved, maybe a little, maybe more than a little, with pension or whatever, to hedge against what most likely is coming, and gold will remain golden. Of that I am sure.